with a critical eye. "They forgot the scoreboard," he said. Then, pointing at 2 rows of out-of-sorts men sitting up in the second deck, definitely not clergymen, though they too were writing in pads, he added, "Not to mention a press box on the field level." Nick himself would be writing a short article about the game for the Examiner. He was just getting started as a sports writer, so even a short piece would be exciting for him. Not that Nick ever allowed himself to seem pleased about anything. In Ruby's memory, he was always forbiddingly tall and loud, quick with a joke, a sharp comment, a sarcastic aside. Only Evie could bring out his gentler side. A procession of dignitaries walked out to the white flagpole in center field, chased almost immediately by a second, more ragged deputation carrying the enormous American flag the first group had forgotten. Nick stood. "I've got work to do," he said, then looked down at Ruby. "You can come with me." When Nick invited her, she went. Ruby stood, and together they worked their way through the preachers and the rest of the crowd towards the stands directly behind home plate. "I have to get some quotations from Miss Ebbets," Nick told Ruby. "Who?" she asked. But he just took her hand, a strong grip, good for a rescue from a crowd, but not nearly as soft or warm as Evie's, and led her on. As they went, they were joined by another man, the senior reporter from the Examiner, Nick's boss. He was a big, bull-like man with a sour face and a rumpled suit. Nick introduced him to Ruby. He barely glanced at her, but all she caught was his first name, George. Grumpy George. That was how she thought of him. The 2 reporters cornered Miss Ebbets in the front row of the grandstands. She was a pretty young woman wearing a long dress, a fur stole, and an enormous flat-brimmed hat. She smiled as Nick and Grumpy George asked her a few questions. Then a man on the field, dwarfed by a huge microphone, boomed something Ruby couldn't understand, and an assemblage of dignitaries joined Miss Ebbets at the railing. Ruby asked Nick what was happening. "She's going to throw out the first ball," he said. He pointed at an umpire standing on the field. "To him!" Everyone around Ruby was remarking on Miss Ebbets' wonderful dignity and sense of fashion, but Ruby didn't care about any of that. She was more interested in the way the young woman threw, with a weak, stiff-armed flip of the wrist. The umpire was standing no more than 20 feet away, but the ball barely reached him. The crowd cheered anyway. Ruby found herself looking down at her arms and thinking, "I bet I could throw harder than that. And maybe these will be good for something." Back in her seat before the game started, Ruby decided on her favorite player. He had a long jaw, a big brash nose, and amazing ears that put Ruby in mind of the rib lamb chops they sometimes had for dinner. He always seemed to be wisecracking, laughing at something a teammate said, pulling a prank or 2. During warm-ups, he threw the ball like his body was going in 3 different directions and ran like his legs were all cramped up. Ruby couldn't take her eyes off him. "Who is that?" she asked Nick. Her brother frowned. "Casey Stengel," he said. "And he could be a useful ball player if he'd just stop with the shenanigans." As they watched, Casey snuck up on one of the other players and stole his cap. "That's who I'd want to be if I played baseball," Ruby thought. In the 5th inning, Casey Stengel rapped a hard one to center field. Everyone, the priests and ministers included, leaped to their feet yelling, and Papa hoisted Ruby up so she could see. Running in, the Yankee center fielder somehow kicked the ball. As it rolled toward the fence, Casey went steaming around the bases on his bandy legs, his face red, his cheeks all puffed out as he rounded third and headed for home plate. He got there ahead of the ball, scoring the first run ever at Ebbets Field. Ruby was giddy with pleasure. Other than that, though, she had trouble following what was going on. She did notice that the Superbus pitcher, Nap Rucker, threw strange, floating pitches, and that Papa turned quite red in the face when Brooklyn's Jake